Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Rare Disease Day Advocacy webinar with our fabulous Kevin Brennan in Washington, D.C. with Bluebird Strategies. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us during Rare Disease Month. And Kevin, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you everybody for joining us today on this Monday. So wanted to talk to folks about Rare Disease Today, which is coming up on February 28th. And that's, a day that the rare disease community and a lot of our partner organizations like NORD have embraced for a long time as a day to help create awareness about rare diseases, about the challenges that folks face in this community, and to unify around awareness and a call to action as far as looking at research, looking at access to healthcare, looking at opportunities to improve coverage for folks who are differently able or for disabilities. There's lots of opportunities here for folks to engage. So what we wanted to do was walk through a little bit of what we're trying to accomplish on behalf of the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation this year. So there's been lots of changes in Washington. Some of those have been traumatic. Some have been part of the change in leadership with the new president, with President Biden coming in. We have a new Congress. So there's been lots of things happening. And I think the important kind of key messages are that there's really important opportunities that shouldn't get lost in all of these changes that need to continue. And the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation has made a great deal of progress in increasing awareness of myotonic dystrophy and continuing to build support in state capitals and in the nation's capital around increased research, focus on public health, access to care, and we want to continue those. So I know that there's a lot of that focus, but we're going to get really into kind of the area of opportunity that the organization continues to have here. So we want to give you a quick update on what are we seeking to accomplish this year. Give some folks a refresher or for first-time advocates an understanding of how to identify your U.S. representatives and your senators, and understand now, again, as we sort of enter in the last, full year. I think the last day that I was, fully out and about in the world, I believe, was March 13th. My kids said they wanted to have an anniversary party for the start of the pandemic. So not sure how I feel about that, but we're coming up on a year, and it's certainly changed a lot of how we engage in our day-to-day lives and activities and things that we do to stay safe. And it's also affected how we reach out to our our representatives in Congress. So we want to sort of talk a little bit about how how it help you understand and navigate that. So we always believe that advocacy can change the world. Members of Congress aren't going to necessarily be aware of myotonic dystrophy unless the community, steps up and reaches out and takes the opportunity to create that awareness, educates them about, what it means, what are the causes, what do we understand about the pipeline as far as treatments, what are we doing as an organization to increase research, how are we helping to catalyze, this pipeline that's going to lead to, the FDA approving the first ever, on-label treatments for myotonic dystrophy. So these are really important things, and they're very simple things. One thing about Congress and about government oftentimes, and this happens in lots of different professions, but you have your own language, you have acronyms that you fall into, and it makes things very mysterious for folks who come from the outside, and it's not always easy to understand. And what we try to do is make sure that we simplify these things, because really what we're talking about is helping empower the community to just have conversations with the people that we elect, who are supposed to serve us in Washington. And so, want to understand, number one is, how does Congress respond to constituents? If you are in a congressional district or in a state, you have one, elected representative in Congress in the House of Representatives, and you have 2 senators. Those are folks that you have an opportunity to vote for, and they're ones that should be paying attention to you and listening to you, because that's who, sent them to Washington. So every 2 years, you're electing your representative to Congress. And then every 6 years, you're electing your senators, and those are staggered. So not every member, all 100 senators are before the election every year. It's a third. So they go in cycles, but these are folks that are supposed to be paying attention to us. Lots of groups, particularly patient groups, engage in advocacy. So in the course of a week, you could have, the American Diabetes Association talking to members of Congress and their staff. You could have people that are road builders, civil engineers. You could have people that are focused on the environment and clean water. Lots of folks are in there, having these conversations. So it's a competitive space, and it's important for us to have really strong messages, and we'll teach you a little bit of how to do that. One thing that's important is that, as patient advocates, in general, since we're advocating on behalf of ourselves and our family members and friends, if you look at the polling, Congress generally has a high favorability, which means they're more likely to be, listening actively to what, advocates have to say, and they're very more likely to want to help. They're going to want to do something that's positive. Whereas in other cases, you may have somebody who's seen as having, say, a commercial interest in a matter, and somebody says, well, I need you to pass this legislation, and you're saying, well, that's a tax break for something or something along those lines. Whereas when you're just coming at it from the patient advocacy perspective, it's viewed differently. So know that. It's not that you wouldn't get hard questions from staff from time to time, but in general, they want to do right by patient advocates. So that's an important thing to know. It's also important, and I think this is something that the community has done very well, is to make these messages personal. Remember that these are, it's from the heart. So we're not asking folks to talk to Congress about things that are well outside of your comfort zone or outside of your knowledge. Part of the message in these brief interactions you're having with your members of Congress and the staff is to let them walk in your shoes, or in the loved one, or in a friend who has myotonic dystrophy, so that they understand a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the triumphs, but understand ultimately then how we translate into converting that message into something that is a very sticky message. It might be, they do engage with lots of people over the course of the week, but you might be the one message that they go home that night, or unfortunately now we're all kind of stuck at home, but you might talk to your friends or loved one around the dinner table and convey something that was really powerful and meaningful to you. And that lends itself then to them thinking about, okay, well then that person asked that we do more for myotonic dystrophy research, so maybe we're more likely to want to do that. So then if we get really down into sort of the objectives themselves, and these are based off of year-to-year work, we're talking about continuing efforts to increase funding at the National Institutes of Health. So that is the premier biomedical research funding agency in the world. And myotonic dystrophy research is something we want to continue to build support for and fund. We want to encourage new researchers to enter the field. We want to make sure there's enough funding out there to continue to allow them to research and ask some of the questions that ultimately get handed off to the pharmaceutical industry, that largely then will take and run the clinical trials that will go to the FDA, and they will ultimately approve these new treatments. As we've looked at ways to continue to build funding for research, we've also had success in the last 3 years in building off of a program that was started in the early 1990s at the Department of Defense, which might seem a little odd to folks, but at the time, the breast cancer community was very frustrated that the NIH wasn't doing enough around women's health issues. So some people worked with, for example, Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont, and they created a peer-reviewed research program within the Department of Defense. And it's based up in Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is about 30 minutes north of Washington, D.C. And we've had success through Senator Dianne Feinstein and other members of the Senate who were advocating on our behalf to include myotonic dystrophy research as one of about 60 plus diseases and conditions that are eligible for research funding under the program. And that particular program is called the Peer Review Medical Research Program. And then lastly this year, and this is something that's brand new, we are going to be advocating that the United States Senate pass a resolution this year that declares a myotonic dystrophy awareness day. So when we talk about the NIH, this is a track of what we've done, and it's not where we want it to be as an organization. So you can see here in fiscal year 2014, NIH funding was at $9 million. and it stayed flat for about 3 years, and it's upticked a bit, and now we're at 13. Now, when you see the very far side of this where it says 2021 estimated, this is where the NIH believes they're going to end up, as far as they will do a request for proposals. They will look at all the proposals that are focused on myotonic dystrophy, and then they will run it through a peer review process that then awards the funding. So that's where they think they're going to end up. In the past couple of years, we've had report language from Congress, which is a directive from Congress that asks the NIH to put more of an emphasis to try to figure out ways to encourage more researchers to engage in myotonic dystrophy research so that we can score higher and have more funds that go out for this research. So then this is where we are in our very young process with the peer-reviewed medical research program. So this is additive to what you've seen to the NIH. And so we've had about 3.1 million in fiscal year 2018. In fiscal year 2019, they awarded $2.4 million in grants. And right now they're in the process of awarding the next round of grants. So we don't have that number yet, but this is additive to that. So you can see how our advocacy is already making a big difference. We've already seen an increase in research because the organization said, look, we need to be creative. We need to find a way to go beyond what NIH was funding. And so we've built up an advocacy program, and we've been able to convince the Senate that this is important. So advocacy is already showing that it's making a big difference in the research portfolio. So then the next step in this process is the Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day. So what we're going to be doing going forward is we're going to be, and we've already kind of drafted some language that we're going to be asking some of our Senate allies and champions to consider sponsoring. But it lays out, it's a great vehicle to lay out sort of the challenges that we face. It talks about the prevalence of the condition. It talks about the opportunities to advance research. And so what we want to find is some of our friends in the Senate who would be willing to raise their hand and say, I will take this resolution that the organization has drafted, and I will introduce this into the United States Senate. And they will move that for passage so that we would have by, I would say, the fall, a pretty good sense that we're going to have a resolution that'll be introduced. So one of the things that we're going to want to do is through Rare Disease Day is make Senate folks aware of what we're doing. And part of my job on behalf of the organization will be to talk directly to some of these offices to find out their level of interest. But it will be really important to be able to point to a number of advocates who've contacted these offices, so that it's not just one person, Kevin Brennan, going in and asking for their help, but that they're seeing that their constituents are very interested in this, which is going to increase our likelihood of success. So let's talk a little bit about, for folks who don't know, how would you figure out, so if you don't know who your representative is or you've forgotten who your representative is, where would you go to figure that out? So right here is the House of Representatives website. So if you were to if you were to write house.gov in your browser, you'd pull up the website for the United States House of Representatives. And what I've done is I've just cut and pasted the very top of that web page so that you can see that there is a Find Your Representative site there. And you start the process simply by adding your email or your zip code to that. Okay. So then what happens is when you pop that up, the next page that you should get, and I'm pretending that I live in Washington, D.C., and I won't get into DC statehood, but I don't currently have representatives and senators. I have a delegate. So what I've used my parents' old address in Maryland to help use this as a template. But sometimes what happens is it may pull up immediately, okay, we know exactly who your member of Congress is based on the zip code. And it'll take you right to that person. So say that it was Andy Harris or Dutch Ruppelsberger or Kwesi Mfume. It could be that one of those folks pops up immediately. But oftentimes you might find that you live in a zip code that is divided up between multiple members of Congress. And when that happens, then you have an opportunity to add your street address, your city, select your state, and then if you click the red bar, that then will show you who your member is. So in this case, it's telling me that Kwesi Mfume is my parents' congressional representative. And you can see here, even the outline, you can see the outline of their congressional district. Some of these districts can get a little strange. as far as how they're drawn. We won't get into sort of gerrymandering for this one. Maybe we'll do another webinar around that. But you can get a sense of that. And then from there, you'd be able to click on Congressman Mfume's name there on the lower mid corner there, and you'll pull up his website. And so if you see here, this will give you an opportunity then to figure out, okay, how do I reach out to him? And most of these are roughly the same. There's some differences, but you'll get a sense of kind of how, to navigate their sites once you get there. But you've got different ways to send, to contact their office. So you can send an email, you can request a meeting, which is the item that we'd want you to click in when we get to that point. You could request a tour, which I don't think they're quite doing those now. Maybe they're doing virtual ones. And you can talk about how to, engage if you needed help with an agency. That gives you a rough idea of how to start, how to figure that out, and then where to go. Each site, like I said, is a little bit different, but in general, you're going to find that there's an opportunity there. Or, you can also pick up the phone and call either their district office or their office in Washington, D.C. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so roughly the same with the Senate. You go in and you dial up, or you type, I don't say dialing up, senate.gov, and this would pull up the Senate lookup part of the site. And in general, then what you'd need to do is you would just look up by state. So you've got a drop-down bar there in the middle that says choose a state, and you'd pull up your state. So in my case, I've pulled up Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. And again, this is very similar to the websites that you'd see for all 100 senators. And you can see there where there's in the middle, underneath the contacting your senators, you're going to see constituent services. And then you'll also see contact on the far right-hand side. Again, it might take a little bit of time just to kind of navigate, get yourself familiar with the site, but they're, hopefully pretty user-friendly as far as the ability to either email them to reach out to request a meeting or to make a phone call. Okay. So now that you have a sense of, okay, so you know where your House member is, you know how to find your senators. So where do you go next? So like I said, you've got two options, basically. You could send an email. And this is a rough script that you could use to create an email, or you can use this as a script if you make a phone call. So what's important to emphasize here is, in this case, you'd say, my name is Jane Doe and I'm a constituent and I live in Hunt Valley, Maryland. So you want to identify maybe the town that you're in, so that they understand that you're a constituent and you live in the state that they represent. And you'd say, hey, I'm calling to see if I could get a call or a virtual meeting with your healthcare staffer. That's the person in the office that you're going to want to talk to. Generally speaking, that person is going to be based in Washington, but it might be that they say, hey, we'd rather have you talk to somebody in the district office. Doesn't matter either way, as long as you're talking to someone in the office and they understand, that that's the person you want to talk to. And this is where they might help guide you to the person you want to see. If you were to call them and say, hey, I have a healthcare issue, I'm having difficulties enrolling in the Medicare program, they're more likely than not to send you somebody to their state or district office who's a caseworker who could help you figure that out. If you're highlighting the fact that you're with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, you're contacting Congress as part of Rare Disease Day, and then when you go into the purpose of your visit, which is to increase awareness of rare diseases like myotonic dystrophy, and talk about how you're interested in increased funding for NIH, that will signal to them that you're going to want to talk to the person who handles legislative healthcare issues for the member of Congress or the senator. So that's roughly what you're going to need. They're going to want to know, do you live in the district? Because that's important. Generally, if you don't, there's no law against contacting a member of Congress or a senator that you're not in their district, but generally what they do is they will forward your call or your email to the office where where you're represented. You want to talk to the healthcare staffer. You want to identify, the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation and Rare Disease Day, and then just give them a sense of what you want to talk about. Okay, and then that way, they might say, well, do you have a particular time or how do you want to handle this? That really is going to be a personal call for you as far as when you're able to, and if you have other folks that are part of the community in your congressional district or state that you want to organize that around. But that's more of just a scheduling piece where then they'll put you in touch with that person and you'll have to sort of negotiate and figure out what's the best time that week to do it. So while we talk about Rare Disease Day and how important that is, these opportunities are they can happen outside of rare disease days. So don't feel like you're tied to the actual day. If it's a little bit before, a little bit after, all good. Okay. So then when you get the meeting set up and you're ready to go, what are the things you're going to do? And I should add too that we're going to be providing folks with some more information as far as materials that you can share with offices after you've done your meeting that'll outline some of the things that we're talking about in a little more depth. But this is where I get back to the point about things being very sticky, okay? So what you have to remember is, generally speaking, a meeting is going to be about 20 minutes. That's generally how these things go. Sometimes they may go a little bit longer. Sometimes they may go shorter. But in general, I think that's the kind of the construct that we ask folks to think about. And it's kind of what the norm is with congressional staff. So again, you want to remind them, my name is Jane Doe. I'm a constituent who lives in Hunt Valley, Maryland. And then I think usually out of that 20 minutes, about 5 to 7 minutes, you're going to want to have somebody who is representing on behalf of the community. Okay, maybe you're talking about, you're speaking on behalf of a loved one or a friend. You're speaking about yourself. A few little tips to think about, when were you diagnosed? Give a little bit of a sense of how it's impacted your daily life. Your ability to do things that some people might take for granted. Has it affected your job? What are some of the significant medical life events that you've experienced as a result of this? Really want to make sure that they understand, what this all means to you. And then after you're finished with that, have an opportunity to, talk about how we're working incredibly hard. We've had flat funding in the NIH space, and we need their support for NIH and for the PR-MRP program funding. Again, we'll have materials that you'll be able to give to them afterwards to see that. And then the other piece is to say we would want, and in this case, it does get a little bit more sophisticated. Everything I've set up till now, if you want to say to House members and Senate staff, completely fine. The Senate really is the area where they're doing these awareness resolutions. The House isn't really doing them as much anymore. So our target here is going to be the Senate. It's not the end of the world if you ask them and they're a House member. It's completely fine. In fact, if you're telling them we're going to be working through the Senate to do that, that's also fine. But don't want folks to feel stressed or that they're somehow making a mistake. Anything that you're doing right now to create awareness, with that message that we want more funding for research is important and should be easy to deliver. Okay. So a little bit of background. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but just quickly so folks understand going in. The PR-MRP program, peer-reviewed medical research program, we were made eligible in 2018. We were added to the list through the support of Senator Feinstein, Senator Durbin from Illinois. We've had a number of really great supporters. As a result of our advocacy, we've had $6 million new dollars in DM research awards. And not only that, but we've also had the opportunity to have a Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation appointed representative who serves on the the scientific committee that reviews the research funding. So again, it's another great opportunity to educate folks in this space, and having a consumer representative has been a really important opportunity. So this is just an example of some of the research awards that have been funded. We're not asking folks to get into, the NRA toxicity and muscle regeneration piece at the University of Virginia, but it is important sometimes, if you're talking to an office, and this is something that I would maybe do more than I would ask advocates to do, at least when you're, getting, you're used to this idea. But, if you're seeing, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, and you want to highlight the fact that the University of Iowa has gotten almost $1 million, in funding, and looking around that, it's an important source of local pride. But this is the kind of thing that, I, on behalf of the organization, will be talking to folks about. But it's just it's an important piece to know, and we like to let folks understand that this is funding real, researchers who are doing really great work that are looking at really important questions. So here's an important point. So a lot of folks get worried, what they're going to ask me? How do I handle these questions? So the important thing, again, to remember is answer what you're comfortable answering. If you don't know the answer to a question, simply say, I don't know. And that's actually a great opportunity to go back to staff later, which again, continues to build that relationship. You can contact me. You can certainly contact Tanya. Anytime you have a question that results from this outreach, ask us and we'll give you the best possible reply that you can have. Want to make sure you guys are equipped to do that, but don't feel, at all stressed about that. If you don't know, you don't know, and you'll tell them to get back to you. So some of our advocacy partners, as I mentioned, are NORD and the Every Life Foundation. And I want to make a quick plug. NORD actually has an advocacy event going on tomorrow, which will be from 2 to 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And it's a state report card. So while I've talked about federal advocacy and the work that we're doing there, the state report card is going to look at things like legislative efforts that may be going on in your state that would help protect consumers from really high out-of-pocket costs with their health insurance. Or it might look at opportunities to expand Medicaid eligibility in your state so that more folks, whether they qualify through their disability or whether they qualify through income, but it's an opportunity for more folks to get the care that they need. So it's looking at various state-based programs like that that are really important. And it just so happens that actually one of my neighbors who lives up the street, Rachel Scher, and a few of her colleagues are going to be leading that program. So if you go to NORD's website, you'll be able to see more information about that. But NORD is a great organization, as is Every Life, and the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation is a member of both. And they're really going to be great partners who are also doing events like this, across the country and across the world to build support for Rare Disease Day. All right, so this moves us to the part of our agenda where we have opportunity for questions. Let me see if folks have questions here. So I think there's an opportunity for folks to do it in the chat box, and I'm going to see if I can figure out. Make sure I've got this fully open.
So there have been a few questions that have come in, Kevin. If I could also read them to you, that would be fine. Okay. So one question was just, is this session being recorded? So yes, obviously this session is being recorded, and we'll have it up on the Digital Academy in the next few days. Another question is, why did research dollars decrease from 2018 to 2019? And how do we help increase that as we move forward?
That is a great question. So in conversations that we've had with NIH, when we've probed on this topic, and we've done it a couple of times, their answer is, well, there weren't enough quality applications to fund. And a little bit of the challenge at times with NIH is we need them to be a catalyst for getting more research applications in the door, So there are opportunities where they can step up and create a bit more of a buzz around this, so that the research community, and it may be that you've got folks that are doing some research topics that are related to myotonic dystrophy, maybe not specifically in that space, and they're made aware of opportunities to do more with NIH. So, everybody follows the peer review process, where you have scientists who look at these applications and then they grade them. And the ones that are the most meritorious, they fund. And so Congress is reluctant to, except in special circumstances, to dictate the amount of money that NIH would spend on a specific disease topic. So what we've done is through the appropriations process, which is the process where they fund the government every year, we will include report language, which simply is just Congress encouraging agencies to look into areas maybe that they're not spending enough time or emphasis on. So every year for the past 2 years, Congress has highlighted the opportunity to attract new, young, smart researchers into the space. And so we're trying harder to get NIH to pay attention to that. And so, as I mentioned, one of the opportunities to increase it, since we haven't had as much success with NIH as we'd like, is going to the Defense Department program, the peer review research program, and say, okay, well, here is an area where we think we can have more success. So we've had, that's been our way of trying to increase the NIH funding, where NIH has been a little resistant to that. So we have to do more work. And you know, the organization has also been doing a lot of great outreach through the various communications vehicles and platforms that we have as an organization to make sure the research community knows, through the annual meeting, you know, through the different publications, but to make sure that folks are out there and doing that. So it's hard. It doesn't lend itself to that direct advocacy in a way that you think, where you pass a law and then that law leads to, you know, the outcome that you want. With NIH, it's a little trickier. So we do continue to have our friends on Congress, you know, make the point that, hey, you know, we need to be doing more in this area. And then we're talking to the NIH, and then we're also working through our research partners, you know, who are at the University of Iowa, the University of Rochester, to see, you know, how they can help us better understand how we can get more folks there. And I think we're going to see success over time, but it's been a little slower than we wanted. I hope that helps answer the question. I know it's kind of complicated and a little bit hard to understand, or at least it is sometimes for me.
Thank you. So the next question is sort of a follow-up to that, and it's, so what if I want to be a reviewer for some of the research grants? What do I do, and will it even help ensure that we receive more money for myotonic dystrophy?
You know, in talking to folks who have done this before, and the opportunity is coming up, and if you want to let Tanya know that you're interested, we can talk about that, because there is an opportunity coming up to nominate folks to be consumer reviewers with the PR-MRP program. And in talking to folks who have been peer reviewers, in talking to folks who have been researchers who have been on the peer review panels, these reviewers do make a difference. They have helped us better understand, and we actually did a whole workshop on this at the annual meeting with some folks that had been in that role, and they were highlighting how they personally felt that they had really changed things, where there were certain grants that got elevated because they highlighted what was going on there. So yeah, I think the answer is a definite yes, and it's important. It really is. It makes a big difference.
Thank you. One question that just came in: are virtual meetings easy to set up, or are phone calls more the vehicle of choice for our representatives and senators?
That is a great question. So I should have highlighted this part. So what's interesting about Congress is they tend to be, I don't know, 2 to 3 years behind the curve as far as technology. Years ago, when I first got started on Capitol Hill, I'd get, friends of mine who worked in the private sector would be emailing each other or going on the web for certain things. And as a staffer, I remember that first day that we got the internet, it was like a big deal. And friends of mine just laughed because they were like, well, we've had that for a while. So my point in that is that, whereas many of us might be used to doing Zoom calls and those sorts of things, the Hill, I find, doesn't do as much of that. And, right now when we're going to them and asking for something, we're a seller and they're a buyer. And so as a buyer, sometimes they get to kind of decide how they're comfortable receiving the information. So in some cases, you may have an office that says, you know what, absolutely happy to do a Zoom call. Send me the invite. You can send them that, or they might be more comfortable just doing a phone call. I would let them be the guide, and also, your comfort level with technology is important too. If you're just, hey, I'd rather do a phone call, then suggest that, and they'll be fine with that. If it's a Zoom call that you're comfortable with, suggest it. See if they're comfortable with it. If they're not and they'd prefer to do a phone call, well, then just go with where they are. But I think that's really kind of a personal preference. I've had, it's funny when I do meetings, virtual meetings with, through my job and what I'm doing, I'll meet with folks and I will always send them my Zoom account when I send them the invite. And I'll get folks that'll tell me, oh, my camera's not working today, or, I need to get my software updated. And more often than not, it's somebody on the Hill who's telling me that, which again is fine. They're not always direct about, they're just not up for it. But if that's the case, just follow them where they lead. And again, make sure it's something you're comfortable with. But either way is fine. Phone call, Zoom call, God willing, soon after we're all vaccinated and we're through the pandemic, you can meet them in the district office or their state office, or you can, come to DC, when we get back to doing, actual fly-ins. So we'll get to actually sit down with people and have face-to-face conversations, which would be terrific.
Great. A follow-up to that is, if we're just having a phone conversation or a video call and we don't have the capacity to do things like share our screens or do anything like that, how do we get materials to the staffers or the representatives or senators? If, what is it that we are meant to give them or share with them if we can't show them in person?
That is a great question. So a couple of things there. One is, we're going to be getting out for you shortly, the documents that I referenced. Okay, so we'll have a one-pager that will talk about our research request, and we'll lay out a little bit of what I said, so that you've got what we would call a congressional leave behind. Something that if we were, pre-pandemic and we were doing an actual fly-in and you were here in Washington, and we were coordinating, say, a day full of meetings for a group of volunteers, you'd have a folder that you would take into the office, you'd open that folder, you'd be able to point to those documents throughout the conversation. So if there's an opportunity to share your screen, these will be virtual documents. And again, I'm not, everybody's got to kind of land where they are comfortably technology-wise. So if you're comfortable sharing your screen and doing it that way with an office, that's great. I wouldn't expect that an office is going to be terribly accommodating as far as setting something up for you where you can easily do that. So if that's the case, I think what's important, and this is something I left out of the presentation, you'll want to ask them the email address for the person you're meeting with. So the healthcare staffer that you're going to see, Rachel Smith at mail.house.gov, or, Bob Smith at feinstein.senate.gov, whatever that email address is, you will have materials to send to them in advance, so that they hopefully then will open that up before your meeting, and they will be able to walk through those documents with you as you make your presentation. Now, it's not going to be in the form of like a slide presentation like I just did. They're going to be probably one-page documents that have bullet points in them, and you can reference those as you go forward. But that'd be the kind of piece then that they'd have through email, and they can follow them with you. So that would work whether you're doing a video conference without screen sharing, and they just have it open and they can look at it and track with you. And then also one that you could just do if you're on a phone call. But we'll make sure that those get set up and drafted and they're ready to go, and you guys can pull those for your meetings when you're ready to go at the end of the month. But those would be the materials that you'd want to email them so that they could have them that way.
Thank you. If we are fortunate enough to get a meeting set up, can we contact the foundation or you, Kevin, for any assistance or for some questions before we get to the meeting?
Absolutely. My email address is on that slide that I ran through, and you guys can email me and we could set up a time to talk. Happy to do that for any and everybody who wants to do that. Our goal here is to continue to grow the number of advocates the organization has. As I said, it matters a lot that, the senator from Alabama hears from constituents in Alabama, the senators from California hear from California constituents. So the community plays such a critically important role. This is one of the top priorities for the organization to help grow that base. And I'm here, whenever we can set up a time to talk for whoever wants to, to kind of walk through, the priorities, how to do the meetings. I'm here for you. So just let me know, and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. A question about the impact that the pandemic has had in the ability to set up meetings. So basically, how has COVID impacted staffing at these offices, and is it making it difficult to actually secure a meeting? And a follow-up kind of to that is, it feels strange in the middle of a pandemic to advocate for something that's not vaccine related, even though it's the most important thing in my life.
Those are really great questions. So let me start with the first. So right now, in my experience, most Hill offices that I talk to on a regular basis, most of the staff are working from home. So most of them have, a laptop. They have an ability to do a virtual meeting, and if they don't want to, they could do one through their computer, like I'm doing with just audio, or they can do it, on their phones. A few offices I've talked to have gotten the vaccine, and some offices are slowly starting to have, maybe some key healthcare staff, or maybe, if there's a healthcare bill on the floor of the House or Senate, that day, or a committee hearing that's important, that particular staff person might be in the office. I don't think, I'm guessing you probably won't have, the public won't be welcome, to do real meetings again, and you won't see this, the place fully, up and running until probably late fall, winter, maybe even the beginning of next year. So I think that right now, it's been interesting. I think they've done a pretty good job of having, the front desk person who would be answering the phone when you called. You might be talking to them from their apartment. It may be that they're in the office, probably doubtful, and they've done a pretty good job of being able to triage folks to the healthcare staffer. And if you run into a problem with that, let me know. That's an area that I can help troubleshoot for folks. But I think that in most cases, they've done a pretty good job of managing that virtually. So you don't, you'd assume that they're all back in their offices in the Rayburn building or the Cannon building. But in many cases, they're operating from home, and they've just figured out, a way to make that work and to get that information between staff. But you may, do a virtual call with somebody who's sitting in their living room, talking to you. So that's one. Number two, I completely understand and I'm really glad you raised the question around COVID and vaccines, because right now, I kind of, as a person who's an advocate who does this on a professional basis, it was particularly tricky, after January 6th. A lot of Hill staff were, pretty shaken up, as were members, with what had happened with the insurrection. And it didn't feel right at all asking questions about the regular legislative process when you just had something like that happen. And then you had the swearing in, and there was the, the experience there, and you had the new administration. So then you've got folks that are being sworn in for cabinet positions. And then President Biden has been very focused on this COVID package. So this package includes, economic assistance for folks who need it, money for vaccines, money for state and local governments that are trying to get the vaccines out and who've had a big hit in their tax revenue because of the pandemic. And then missing something. So there's a number of things in there that are very COVID specific, vaccine specific, or economic relief specific, like unemployment insurance, for example. So yes, it feels a little bit right now, perhaps, with all of that going on, a little bit like, how does this fit in? This doesn't seem like it's as big a priority as that. I think it's important to acknowledge that in the call and say, look, we understand that Congress has a lot going on, and we applaud, the focus that's happening, because there's a lot of people that need this help, and we certainly want to get these vaccines out really as fast as we possibly can. So, feel free to mention that, and tie that into the fact that, I know many of the folks that are in this call are in the community. You might be 1B or 1C, depending on how your state has laid out the vaccination process. So, folks who have co-occurring or comorbid conditions like myotonic dystrophy are, further, ahead in the queue. And I speak of somebody who has psoriatic arthritis, who, my wife asks me every day if I've checked in to see what DC is doing on that. So I think it's really important to tie that into the story, to let folks know that, this year has been a difficult year for folks because of these dual threats that we face. But at the same time, then it's okay to kind of take that period to transition into the regular legislative process, because Congress in a couple of weeks is going to get the president's regular budget. What normally happens, and I didn't get into this process, but I'll take a few seconds to describe it. Every January, the president, gets before Congress for the State of the Union. It's delayed in an election year because you have the inauguration where the president has a chance to speak to the nation from the platform in front of the Congress. And then A couple of weeks after that is when the president submits the budget to Congress. So in this case, we're talking about the fiscal year 2022 budget. Congress is going to start the process at the same time they're talking through COVID and this big COVID relief package. They're going to have to put together the budget for next year. And that budget's going to fund NIH and HHS, and it's going to fund CDC, and it's going to fund the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense. So all of the regular functions of government are going to have to happen. So Congress is going to have to be able to, walk and chew gum in this case. And so, they're getting ready to hold hearings, invite the cabinet secretaries in to testify, to defend their budgets. So this is an entirely appropriate point in time to do that towards the end of February. But I think it's really important, and I'm glad that you raised the question of how to sort of live in the world of, COVID 24/7 with, these, regular, legislative questions, because they're important. But it's entirely appropriate to ask that. But I do think it's a great idea to just make sure you're thinking about how to weave your story in, with the pandemic that we've all been living through for the last year. So hopefully that answered that question, or those two questions.
Another somewhat related question. Myotonic dystrophy is a rare disease, but we are not on the list to receive the vaccine sooner rather than later. How do we advocate to receive the vaccine sooner? Is this something we can take to our representatives?
That's another great question. So the process for determining these recommendations started at CDC, at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they have an advisory committee that is called the ACIP. And I can't remember the name of it right now off the top of my head, but it is basically the group that looks at, you think of all the childhood vaccines that are there. They're the ones that make the recommendations to the nation around how to distribute, how to prescribe, related to that. So ordinarily there isn't that much focus on this group and the recommendations that they make. There's been a lot of focus because of the idea that we started the pandemic started largely in that March 13th timeframe that I talked about. So it's incredible to think that the federal government and the private sector from March till December, less than a year, were in their labs, did the clinical trials, went to the FDA and said, here is our our vaccine candidate. We would like what's called an emergency use authorization. So it's different than a regular disease approval. But the fact that we as a country in the world, we've been able to take that process, which normally is taking years, and and take that down to less than a year, that we've got drugs that are done. The challenge, of course, next is that you've got to build, the lines that are going to make these products. And in some cases, through what they call Operation Warp Speed under the Trump administration, they were able to do some of that in advance. They took some risks and said, we don't even know if this is going to work yet. It's still in the clinical trial phase. We're going to start manufacturing this. Meaning if this didn't succeed, all that vaccine that they made was going to go to waste. It wouldn't have been used. But thankfully, in the case of Moderna, and in the case of Pfizer, and now J&J, they've had success. They've had good clinical trials data. So it's really kind of remarkable that we're even at this point. So, what happens is after they received their emergency use authorization, then the vaccine experts who were on this group at CDC came up with the recommendations. Now they're simply recommendations. Each state takes that information and makes its own plan. So that's mine is a long-winded response that yes, I think depending on where you live, you might want to do what I did as far as looking up your state representative or delegate. In each state, the names are a little bit different. And you may also then want to look up your state senator and find out who those folks are and talk to them about what's happening. It might also be really important, as I said, to just plug again the NORD webinar that's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know that they're specifically talking about this, but I think they might be. It might be an opportunity to learn a little bit more from one of our partner organizations around what they're advising folks to do, since the rare disease community is largely in the same category. As I said, in DC, I know it's 1C is the group that largely captures most of the folks who have comorbid conditions. But that's absolutely where you should go. It's the state. I don't think at this point that there's much happening on the federal level that's going to change what they've already come up with, but each state, there is an opportunity to make them aware. So I hope that's helpful. And again, if there's something I can do afterwards offline, feel free to email me for not just this question, but for any of the questions that were asked.
Thank you. Besides research, how do we advocate for resources in our local areas for myotonic dystrophy? So I think this question is getting to, if there are resources that someone might need for mobility or for any other reason, and they don't have access to those right now, what's the best way to go about that? It's not a research focus at all.
Understood. Well, a couple of things. One is, I would point folks to the NORD call that's going to happen tomorrow about sort of the state opportunities. There's a lot of different resources, so I don't know exactly where you're focused. It might be good to, if you have a chance to just add an example to your question. There's different state programs, there's different local programs. It sort of depends on what the target is, what resource we need more of. And I can maybe provide more advice for the questioner, offline, but I don't know specifically. I mean, there's lots of different places to go where we can ask for that. And I can certainly help teach folks how to become advocates, no matter what the issue is, and how to tailor the question and try to bring others, with you in the community so that it's not just you speaking by yourself and alone, but there's other folks who may also be asking that the entity, provide more resources or whatever it is that you think you all need.
Thank you. And I'll follow up with that too and say that MDF also hosts on our website financial resources for different states in the US, all 50 states in the US. We don't have that information available for other countries, unfortunately. But if you're looking for specific resources like a chair or something to that extent, the financial resources we do have on the website may be helpful, but you can also please reach out to MDF directly at info@myotonic.org, and we can follow up with you and get that URL to you directly and see if there's other ways that we can help. Another question, Kevin, that came in is, what if we live outside of the United States? How do we advocate for progress in our countries?
Another great question. These are really good questions. Thank you, guys. That's a trickier one to answer. I mean, again, some of the tools that we have shared, I think they work in, you can kind of plug and play them anywhere. So if you're in the UK or you're in the EU, you need to figure out, okay, so what's the challenge? What's the problem that I'm trying to solve? If it's a research question, then you'd want to research and figure out, okay, so is there a state or a federal or a country-based entity that is providing research that's focused on, disease-specific questions? And, maybe then talking to your legislatures about, well, how do I change that? I mean, one of the great things too is that, as a constituent in a democracy, legislators, whether it's the Congress or a parliament, they generally are motivated to want to help educate you and help understand how, the system works. And so if you find the right staff person, you can develop a relationship and help them teach you a little bit of, how to solve some of those problems. So it might be that they can educate you on that. If research, is the area of focus and you want to look again at, say, in Europe or Japan or Australia or wherever, in general, there are public programs that are funding scientists in your country that are looking at heart disease and diabetes and other challenges. And so, talk to them about that. Ask them if they can help point you in the right direction. And again, happy to help. I haven't done any direct advocacy or lobbying in the places that I've talked about, but I have worked with other organizations. Years ago, I led the public policy office for the Arthritis Foundation in Washington, D.C. for about 8 years. And I worked with some of our international partners around awareness days and other sort of joint activities that we do. So I have some sense of that. But I think that, that's where I'd start, and I'm certainly happy to help dig in a little more deeply if you'd like.
Okay. We have one question that came in, Kevin, that I don't think it's directed necessarily to you, but maybe we can just, maybe I can answer it actually. So this is a question from someone outside of the US, and they're asking if there is a cure so far found anywhere in the world for myotonic dystrophy, and then 2, is there anything that can be done? So it's sort of a similar question that we just received. And what I'll say to start is just that unfortunately we do not yet have a cure for myotonic dystrophy type 1 or type 2, but we have over 40 companies right now working on this, and we have several going into clinical trials, and it's very exciting. We are closer than ever to finding different treatments that will focus on specific symptoms, and we're getting closer to finding a cure. We are just not quite there yet. With respect to how you deal with this in different countries or how you promote it, I think, Kevin, would you say that it's exactly what you have just recommended folks do to advocate at every level, whether it's their local level or their federal level?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it starts with awareness. It starts with sharing your story, and then it ends with, or it doesn't end, but it moves to questions about, well, help me understand, is it, what entity, within our country that, that provides funding for these types of things, and how can I help do more? And you may find that, you're part of a European or, again, some other organization that's raising funding to support private research. I think legislators and elected officials always like to hear whether you're leveraging, your own, finances and support as an organization to then leverage, private dollars. And if you can figure out, maybe there's some research going on in muscular dystrophy at a university that's nearby, and maybe you dig a little deeper and you find out that it's myotonic dystrophy too. I think it's a great opportunity to become an expert and learn more about it. But lean on your elected representatives to help you answer some of those questions and help figure that out. And what you might find too is that you develop even deeper relationship. When I was at the Arthritis Foundation, I had one of my really wonderful volunteers, and she not only got to know Senator Kit Bond from Missouri, who she got to know really well, and she got married a couple of years later up at West Point, New York, to a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy there. And the Senate staffer was invited to the wedding, and she went. And they developed this lifelong, deep friendship. So you never know where these are going to end. And don't be afraid of asking a couple of questions, because you might find that they're really interested in helping you. And so I just would encourage you guys to kind of dive into that. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, I think there's only one other question that we have, and it looks like we're just at the right amount of time too. And that question is, are there opportunities to become more involved in MDF itself? And absolutely, there are other ways to become involved. And I will just say, if you'd like to email us at info@myotonic.org, we'll be able to connect with you directly, and we can find out what your interests are, and we can move from that direction. That way we have your direct contact information. That would be fantastic. I think that's it. We're sort of at time. Kevin, is there any last words or anything you'd like to wrap up with?
No, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to represent the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation here in Washington, D.C. But we can't do it alone. And I'm really grateful that all of you are spending some time and energy to do this. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I love working with this organization. I love working with the community. So don't be shy.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for being with us, for helping us kick off Rare Disease Month, and for helping guide us so that we can become better advocates and develop these relationships with our representatives and senators. As we
Thank you,
mentioned
Tanya.
in the beginning, this will be recorded, but you can also follow up with Kevin. Just send an email to the foundation and we will absolutely connect you. And this will be posted on the Digital Academy. Thank you all. We hope you have a fantastic week and we'll see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.